Hello everybody, and today we're going to do another episode of History's Alright. Now, and well, this will be the first one that Muddy is in. But, you know, need not disturb him too much. Now, I know I haven't done these in a while, possibly because a lot of the topics have been somewhat covered by the politics of writing, but that's okay. Now, today we're going to talk about morality. Not like right and wrong, but the moral mood of your work and how to do it. Like, what, in a way, the moral tone. What kind of tone to use and where. So, what kind of moral tones are there? Well, there's a very simple. Well, we'll start off with the most simple, called simple morality, also known as innate morality. Namely, that characters have some quality within them and that they are basically just good or bad. Or that some immutable characteristic about them makes them good or bad. Or the idea of the innateness. Something about someone puts them in the idea of good or bad. Technically neutral could also be in this, but neutral rarely gets used for some reason. Probably because it's not that interesting in some ways. I mean, Futurama did it that one time, but obviously. But let's try and make this whole thing meaningful. So, my future self will hopefully have put up an image for us showing the DNA background. Yes. So, as we can see from these, where my ancestors came from. Now, as I say, there's a lot that can be said about identity, but we're going to say that for autism and public life. So, as we get to see where the ancestors came from, at least using Ancestry DNA's categories. So there is England and Northwest Europe, Ireland, Scotland, Germanic Europe as they call it, and Spain. No real surprises there, but here's the question. What does that tell you about my personality or morality? If you answered nothing, that is showing you have a deeper understanding of people beyond mere archetypes or labels. And don't worry, all sorts of writers can see beyond those kinds of things. After all, The Lord of the Rings does this. You might think, isn't that a simple morality tale? Well, actually, no. It's set up like that one. From what I gather, it uses a lot of the tropes that were common in literature at the time, playing on them perhaps. But if it was a simple morality tale, Frodo would not succumb to the ring. But of course he does. In fact, the whole story, his most significant battle, is the battle between the desire to coerce others, embodied in the ring, and the desire to live in harmony with one's neighbours. Sam wins by choosing the path of harmony, but Frodo ends up being destroyed by the ring and the lust for power. So you might think, so what is it then? Well, it's more of a traditional morality tale, as they call it. Not sure why. Some of these terms are used in academia. I don't particularly understand them, but they're used in this way I've often seen them written. Anyway, what is the point of a traditional morality? Well, it's the idea that there's a, as it were, a moral tradition, a law of the universe that exists independently of any of the characters. Now, it can be whatever you like in a lot of ways. You know, maybe it's like some law that is put down. Could be some greater goal to achieve, what they call deontological and teleological, all in philosophy circles, respectively. Could be like certain virtues that people can aspire to. Could be more of a sort of, you know, a pragmatic ethic. But to be honest, you can use any you like, but it probably will work better if it's implicit, or something the readers can figure out for themselves, rather than, how you put it, bludgeoned in their face. You know, in the same reason that those interpretations I gave you of The Lord of the Rings are things that I've read. Now, I haven't read The Lord of the Rings much. I may have read some of it a while back, but it's so long ago my head's a bit tired. But anyway, I've selected certain interpretations by certain Tolkienologists, which are those who study the works of J.R. Tolkien, and other Tolkienologists may disagree. And but that's the point, there's a subtlety to it. If you're not subtle about it, it'll come across like propaganda. Now, and feel like the story's less about entertaining your audience than about trying to promulgate your view. The difference between a party political broadcast and a good story is thus, in these terms. A good story allows you to enter the imagination, and a propaganda piece forces the message front and centre. Sort of like that. Now, there are other ways of doing morality in your books. In fact, there's quite a popular one at the moment called grey morality. I say popular, there are also people who really hate grey morality. For various reasons. I mean, for one thing, there are those who argue it's kind of overused. It's excessive. Now, what even is grey morality? Well, put it in simple terms, it's the idea that everything is tainted. There isn't any goodness in the world. Everything's just self-interested, quote-unquote Machiavellian, although if you read The Prince you might wonder why the term is applied to this kind of moral thinking. But basically ideals or morals are just portrayed as idiotic. With works such as, and you know, yes, there were George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, I gather, is held up as an example of grey morality. Although it wasn't invented by him. I mean, Voltaire uses it in his Candide. Admittedly, I've only read it in translation. But there is that point with Master Pangloss's everything is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. I.e., things are how they are, and that's how they were meant to be. The Bay of Lisbon was created for James the Good Anabaptist to fall into it. So he says. But anyway, so one must wonder, why is it so used? Why is it so popular? And why is it so unpopular? Well, the unpopular might be because people feel it's overused, or a lazy cop-out, or just tiresome to drudge through a world that is just one load of misery after another, and plus, of course, the popular misconception that misery equals deep. You know, a deep work doesn't have to be miserable. We're already showing that with Lord of the Rings. But also, a miserable work doesn't have to be deep. Because we can also ask the question of this sort of nihilistic worldview of grey morality. What then? The same question asked by Friedrich Nietzsche of nihilists. What then? There's Nietzsche's idea that you've killed God and you're standing over his corpse. Well, what are you going to do then? You've killed all meaning and morality, the source of all meaning and morality, so you're just going to wallow in nihilistic despair forever? That's not philosophy. So says Nietzsche. It's been a while since I've read it and I've kind of condensed it down, but still, a lot here. So we then have to deal with that question. What then? What do we do when we've got to this idea of saying, well, nothing's really meaningful, everything is dying, everyone is self-centered. Oh, all right. So what are you going to do with that? Well, so you might think from that, oh, so does that mean grey morality is beyond salvation and just wallows in nihilistic despair like an immature philosopher? Oh, Nietzsche's term, I believe. Well, I'd say not really. There are ways of making it work. Now, I think it's probably best to understand where grey morality comes from, because it itself is something of a reaction to what we call romanticism. Now, don't worry, I'm referring to the literary tradition, because romance isn't just about smoochy smoo with your significant other, it's about the ideals. Literally, the word, when coined by Eleanor of Aquitaine, meant of the Romans. This idea of Roman virtue, thus romantic, of the Romans. And this idea that the Romans, with their stoic virtues and all sorts of stuff and like that, and living up to those. So it'd be the ideal of marriage, the ideal of heroism, the ideal of honour, the certain social rituals, not like an innate morality or a traditional morality, which could come to think of it also be called an idealistic morality, because in an idealistic morality, the ritual can become corrupted if it fails to understand its purpose and becomes done for the sake of it. But the moral meaning of the ritual, but if moral meaning is derived from these social rituals, then it's more romantic than idealistic in that sense. Now, you might be thinking, ritual, that sounds like very religious. And yes, it can be, but it doesn't have to be. So, think of it this way. You set your alarm clock to go off at a certain time each day. You brush your teeth. Now, you could say maybe that's a hygiene purpose, but still, you comb your hair. Maybe you comb your hair. Or putting makeup on. These are little things we do. We don't think always about why we do them. or the moral meaning as to why they're done. Now, in a romantic ideal, there's that perfectly made up person who looks immaculate, perhaps, and maybe some might argue, and then of course we can develop our story. You know, is there anything on the inside? Are they neglecting their inner beauty for the pursuit of outer beauty? And that might be, or the aspiration, and that's part of the point of the romantic moral. It's the aspiration to live up to the ideal of, say, the knight is quite a popular example in fiction of the chivalric code of a knight who exists with honour. Honour, and by a set of values which vary a little bit across culture. King Arthur and his knights are something of an example. You know, the knight, he'll defend his kingdom, his lady's honour, his king's virtue, ja, und so weiter, und so weiter. A similar process happened in Japan with Bushido, especially in the Edo period, and after the Meiji Restoration. There was a similar romanticisation of the role of the samurai. And let's talk about something else, after all. Marty. Yes. See Marty. And the way he likes to snooze in his little bed. The ideal of having a cat. The ideal of a pet to snuggle up to and fuss. But there's also the other side to it. And that is where realism comes in. I mean, yes, I could make an example of removing the effluence from Marty's litter tray. That would be a grotesque, which was a literary practice of bringing out the unpleasant side of a human existence and bringing it to the forefront. But realist was more like, actually it's more about rough and smooth. So there are some bits about having a pet that can be quite tiring, you know, rushing around, wandering about, keeping an eye on them, make sure that nothing gets knocked off the perch by accident. Marty wouldn't mean to do anything. And making sure he's all comfortable. But, the warmth, the companionship, and the fun times just spent away from the desk, playing with the pussycat and hearing his purr, makes it all worthwhile, one might say. So, when you're looking after a pet, there are important concerns. That's another being. That's another living being in your life. You've got to make sure he's okay. Yeah. Sorry. So, when it comes to grey morality, one could also look to the idea of, okay, so there perhaps isn't an order to the universe. And sometimes it's not always the sort of beautiful, easy moments of the cat sleeping in the basket, or the cat bed if you prefer. It is also, so there's, these moments, but also making sure that his curiosity doesn't get him too spooked or frightened or anything. Helping him get used to the dogs. But still, that is an important point. So we've got this idealistic or traditional, as they call it sometimes, romantic, realistic, grotesque. And this can add a lot to our greyness. Because you might feel, well, maybe there is no ultimate truth in your world. But then we go from there. So, are we building towards a better truth? Or how do your characters react to this idea? Do they entirely know it? Do they entirely believe it? Does it matter to them? And these can create more interesting dynamics, after all. After all, a character clinging to their ideals in a world that doesn't necessarily reward it, or at least not in an obvious way, can be quite interesting. Plus, of course, when it comes to reward, what do we value? Is it maybe your character is good because it's the right thing to do in their at least in their eye, or because they like having fame and fortune, or it's perhaps more suitable to their political position to appear virtuous among the people, or perhaps they have or some other advantage. And so this kind of, plus of course there's the idea of the complex morality, and that is the trade-offs. So there are real and consequential choices, and you have to choose between them, especially good in an interactive medium. Something like a role-playing game, a computer game, a board game on Savita are all more conducive to the idea, but they're not always. But this can feel a little bit harder to do with a non-interactive medium like a book or a film or a television program, because the characters are scripted and you, the writer, are essentially playing them without basically connecting them with your audience, although that might involve its own video of how to of how to help your audience connect with your characters. But then, that might actually help us make our grey world a bit better. How do we react to it? What do we do? Do we take advantage of there being no order in the world to build our own? Or perhaps not our own order, but to try and build an order even if we're not at the head of it? Do we use it for our own gain? Do we appear virtuous because we live in a society where that's more socially acceptable? As I say, we can go on, and I don't want you to feel confined, but the point is, on saving grey morality, perhaps make it sparing. Make it seem like something was achieved, even if it's just on the scale of your characters, so that your audience doesn't feel like, oh, that was a waste of time, now I'm just miserable. But we can make it also interesting. And, as I say, very important, never beat your audience over the head with your moral philosophy. Or the moral philosophy of your world, because you might actually be creating a world whose rules are based on something that you disagree with because you're trying to critique that system. So, and hey, there's a sort of rough with a smooth aspect. Sometimes Marty likes to come up and have cuddles and lie on me because he's a lovely cat. Isn't he a lovely cat? But, if he's standing on my chest too much, that can make me cough and wheeze. I've had chest infections and stuff like that. So it's more like in moderation. And that's the point. We can adapt our characters to our world. You know, how do we adapt to our order? But you also might be thinking, oh, do I have to do a degree in philosophy just to write stories? Because this feels very complicated. Well, firstly, I've not done a degree in philosophy. I did up to A-levels, and then a lot of the rest was kind of self-taught and from hanging out with philosophers on philosophy servers and watching philosophy videos. Yeah, I mean, it's been years since I even read Nietzsche. But, you know, something to do, I guess. And the point is... what was I going to say? Yeah. There's also another thing about morality in your writing. You don't have to have any. You don't have to have a moral order if you don't wish to. You could just be exploring imagination. Pure escapism. I mean, maybe values that you hold very dear might seep into your work, but that's going to happen. And in fact, the less you stress about it, the better your story will be, because you're probably not trying to just sandpaper off any possible interpretations of your work. Because it's actually a good thing if people are talking about the meaning of your work. Because it's not boring if there's something to talk about. But it can just be a whimsical adventure in fantasy. Tolkien hated allegory. He even says he doesn't put any in his books. Sorry, he even said he didn't put any in his books. Need to remember how past tense works in English. Still, you can just have a fun adventure. What is the meaning of Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island? I don't know. I read it, but I don't know. Historians, well, probably more literary people, will debate what it means. What the themes are. But it can just be a sort of interesting adventure. Adventure of a young boy goes and fights pirates and gets some buried treasure. Arr. All that stuff. Although, in fairness, if you read it, there is at least some depth of of the fact that, well, you know, by the end, it does feel like Jim has feelings about the experience. I don't want to say too much because I don't want to spoil the book. But still, that's worthwhile noting. You know, just because it's a fun adventure that doesn't necessarily have a particular comment about life and the world doesn't mean there can't be depth as well. Because you can just think, how would people react? Essentially, what I'm saying is, don't focus too much on the model. Make it a people-centered. If your story starts from your characters and works your way up, you can have a lot more dynamism to it. Makes it more dynamic, more flow, you can talk about things or not. And either way, hope your writing works well with your morality system. Hope you have lots of fun. And yes, Marty's having a sleep now. And however you like writing, whether you're more of an escapist, a realist, a romanticist, idealist, or just don't have a particular model and don't feel like getting one, it was lovely having you here.